But we haven't talked about you. Which identity is the most important to you? Or do they have equal impact on you?
I think, like Becky, to me, I'm Ruth, but, you can't divide yourself up into a series of identities and of labels. I'm a lesbian, I'm a grandmother now. If you'd asked me this 20, 30 years ago, I'd have said I'm a lesbian mother, probably before anything else. I'm a disabled woman, I'm lots of things. I'm a gardener, Those things, those labels are not the only thing, but the important thing to me is to be recognised for the totality of who we are, and not to be asked to be just disabled. That was why I was quoting Sojourner Truth, that whole idea that, as black women, ain't I a woman? As a disabled woman, ain't I a woman too? And that as disabled women, we're seen as genderless, really. You even have so-called disabled toilets. I remember going to a disabled women's conference in Germany, and there was a group of women who did a skit about this, about toilets, that toilets have 3 genders, male, female, and disabled. Of course, if you didn't fit any of those, that's another story. But I think that whole issue about identity is quite a complex one. I come from a generation where we chose an identity very consciously, not only as women, but very often for many of us as lesbians. And you still find that people will talk about LGBT, they'll talk about gay, but somehow the word lesbian is far too sexual, far too direct, far too obvious. So, I think it's complex, it depends on the context, but in the end, I am me, and those labels are only a small part of who I am. But I want to be recognised for who I am. I don't want to have to leave part of me on the doorstep and apologise for part of me. And that includes not having to apologise for my sexuality, for my life history, and for my, for being a woman, for being disabled, etc. And I think that's the important thing, that we don't have to apologise, but also that we are welcomed and recognised, and that the experience that we've got is recognised and taken account of in how anything is organised, done, thought about, etc. And that's the problem. I mean, I think, to me, intersectionality is a new word. I had to look it up in the dictionary. We talked about multiple oppression. But it's probably something that's describing a reality that's a lot more complex. So I think, to me, I'd talk about inclusion, I suppose, really. But in the end, it's about the same thing. It's about recognising that our differences bring you together. I can't remember the quote from Audre Lorde, but there's a wonderful quote about not being afraid of... it's not our differences that divide us, it's the fear of our differences, I think was the quote, which I think says it all, really.
If I may quickly add something to that, is one of... I was very honoured that I got to meet Rashida Manjoo, who was the special rapporteur for sexual violence, and she came to the UK, and she mentioned that one of the problems is there is a gender neutrality. So that is a problem with disabled people's organizations, is that we talk about disabled people, but we don't talk about disabled women. So that's that huge gap. So why do you call yourself an activist? I think you do call yourself an activist. And what has shaped you in that journey there?
I mean, I'd call myself a human rights activist. I think, it's funny, I was thinking about this on the way here. I think the thing that shaped me was probably my mother more than anything else, who was a strong feminist and who was a communist. But also the experience of growing up as a foreigner not long after the war in France, where I experienced a fair amount of xenophobia, including being tied to the tree for having burnt Joan of Arc, which always was a strange thing. But in those days, the sort of super-nationalism of Europe, unfortunately, was starting to take a hold again. And very early on being aware of anti-Arab racism, I think, more than anything else. And of stuff that happened in the early 60s when I was still a child, when a demonstration of Algerian migrants in France, that was at the time of the Algerian War of Independence, were set up on by the police, and 200 people were murdered and thrown into the river in Paris, and it still affects me. And it was hushed up. My mother had a friend who was a journalist, and I can remember them sitting around the kitchen table talking about this. And for me as a child, that was an impression that really, something that really stayed in me and stayed in my memory. It still does. And that the injustice of the silence around that, and I think the silence more than anything else, the mass murder of a group of people who were simply fighting for their right to self-determination. So I think that, and I was of the generation of 1968 in France, so I dutifully went off and threw paving stones at police officers who retaliated by raping a friend of mine, and I think that was probably seeing the violence against women. And I came to Britain in the early 70s when the women's movement was being born, and found a movement that I think in the early stages was very local and very much turned to America and to the States, because of that had been the inspiration, but gradually started to become much more international. And for a while I was on Outright, women's newspaper. There were a socialist feminist women's publication at the very end of it. It's not my fault that it closed, but at the very end of it. So I think a lot of the kind of perspective that I had was an internationalist one because of my experience and my background, and was involved alongside women's, trying to set up a women's centre, lesbian mothers network, and trying to fight for the right to keep our children, because at the time if you said you were a lesbian and a mother, that was something that the two words didn't go together. And interesting, now I find myself in a situation working with disabled women now where the two words don't go together, where there's an assumption that as a disabled woman you're an unfit mother. Hasn't changed that much, just the label has changed. But I was very much involved in anti-racist things and in trying to stop people being deported and so on, and involved in community politics. So I've always been a kind of grassroots activist in my own neighbourhood in East London, and kind of, you know, it's been about that. And gradually, when I became disabled, got kind of dragooned into the disability movement by a couple of friends who basically said, stop feeling sorry for yourself and get on with it, and there's a demonstration to organise. So I was used to organising demonstrations, so I did. And I kind of haven't looked back. But I think it's always been from within a sort of human rights perspective, and from a sort of international point of view, and I still kind of keep links with people in other countries, and I think that's really important in terms of understanding the experiences of disabled women, for example. You know, that where we're starting from is not the same in every country. Our experiences of impairment are different, you know, and lots of other things, really. So, I mean, I suppose that's my background of activism. And it's fantastic to see a new generation of feminists are coming along who got that internationalist perspective.
Thanks.